Have you ever wondered where on earth humans no longer sit at the top of the food chain? Imagine a land larger than Japan, perched directly on the Pacific Ring of Fire. Yet almost invisible on the world's travel map. Why has a place this magnificent remained hidden for centuries? Some call it the Iceland of Asia, but forget the softness of that comparison. This land is wilder, harsher, and more primordial than you can imagine. Welcome to Russia's final frontier, a place where the Earth is still being born. This is Kamchatka. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. It begins in a place that feels almost impossible, a city clinging to the edge of civilization, yet carrying the weight of centuries. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky grew from a lonely outpost into a living reminder of how stubborn the human spirit can be. As the administrative, industrial, and cultural center of Kamchatka Krai, the city carries a long record of military distinction. It sits in the southeastern part of the peninsula and is home to roughly 181,000 residents. The people here learned early that the world does not bend for them. There is no road leading in or out. Every person arrives by air or by sea, stepping into a landscape shaped by fire and ice and 3 towering volcanoes that rise like ancient guardians. The city's documented history reaches back to Vitus Bering, the explorer who arrived in these waters in the 1740s and established the early presence that shaped its development and many of its place names. Later, during the Crimean War, a small band of hunters and fishermen stood against a powerful fleet and refused to give up their home. That moment, brief and fierce, became a cornerstone of local pride. From above, the city seems to rest in a bowl of mountains. Steam drifts from distant fumaroles, mixing with the breath of the sea. Life carries on as if the unusual is simply ordinary here, and perhaps that is the charm of Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. Avacha Bay, Avacha Bay introduces a shift in scale that is hard to ignore. The water opens wide beneath the passing clouds, creating a natural harbor deep enough to shelter vessels even during the hardest Pacific storms. For generations, it has been the city's lifeline, the place where ships arrive, where families gather on the piers, and where daily life meets the larger forces of the ocean. Humpback whales follow seasonal feeding routes that bring them close to the shoreline, their breath rising in tall white plumes. Harbor seals drift near the rocks, occasionally lifting their heads as if assessing the quiet activity along the waterfront. These animals appear regularly enough that residents treat their presence as part of the environment rather than a spectacle. It creates an unusual overlap where the routines of a working port exist beside the movements of some of the Pacific's most powerful species. As the afternoon light softens, movement across the water shifts in a quieter rhythm. Fishing boats trace their way toward the docks, while, farther out, the curved backs of whales rise and disappear again. Near the entrance of the bay, 3 tall rock pillars known as the Three Brothers stand in a loose formation, shaped by centuries of storms and tides. Their surfaces catch the fading sun, turning from gray to amber as the day settles. Seabirds weave between them, using the stone walls as shelter before returning to open water. The combination of daily harbor activity and the stark rock formations forms a landscape that is easy to observe and difficult to mistake for anywhere else. The Avacha River. The Avacha River spreads into a wide floodplain as it approaches the southeastern coast of Kamchatka. The channel divides and reconnects in long serpentine loops that cut through low marshes and patches of soft, water-saturated ground. From above, the river appears as a network of curves shaped by steady flow and seasonal deposits. Forming a visual contrast to the straight, steep coastlines that dominate much of the peninsula. Wetlands extend on both sides of the main channel. Grasses, reeds, and clusters of willow create a mosaic of green that shifts in density as the water level rises and falls. Small ponds form between the loops, holding calm surfaces that show only slight ripples from passing birds or distant wind. The slow pace of the water allows sediment to settle, and the floodplain becomes a broad filter that processes everything carried downstream from the interior valleys. Local wildlife uses the floodplain as a transitional zone, Waterfowl gather in the quieter pools. And fox tracks appear along the firmer edges of the marsh. The river maintains a consistent rhythm, moving with enough force to shape its route, yet slow enough to preserve areas of stillness that stretch for hundreds of yards. As the floodplain widens, the curves begin to straighten and the vegetation thins. The river completes its final bends before meeting the tidal influence of the Pacific. The last calm stretches of fresh water hold their shape briefly before merging with the stronger currents that define the coastline ahead. Kalaktirski Black Sand Beach. The shoreline shifts again into something darker and more austere as the sand beneath the viewer turns a deep volcanic black. It stretches in a long, uninterrupted sweep. The color coming from ash and shattered lava that settled here over thousands of years. Each wave rolls in with a cold weight, spreading white foam across the dark surface, before pulling back and revealing the same stark contrast again. The Pacific feels especially raw in this place, its rhythm steady but forceful, carrying the kind of chill that lingers even in midsummer. Farther along the coast, the wind pushes low mist across the beach, softening the edges of the landscape. The combination of black sand, bright surf, and drifting haze gives Kalaktirski Beach a look rarely found elsewhere. Locals arrive with surfboards despite the temperature, reading the water with practiced ease and moving through the waves without hesitation. Their presence underscores the character of this coast. It is harsh at times, but its clarity and openness draw people back, offering a view that stays simple yet unforgettable. Mutnovsky Volcano. The first impression arrives with the sound of moving steam. It rises in steady bursts from vents scattered along the slopes, creating a low rumble that blends with the wind. Snowfields cut through the terrain in irregular shapes, and the contrast between white ice and exposed stone becomes stronger as the path climbs higher. Meltwater flows in narrow channels, carrying thin layers of sediment. Each stream heads toward a deeper basin, shaped by repeated thermal shifts. The activity intensifies near the central fumaroles. Heat pushes upward with enough force to lift clouds of vapor that drift and reform in slow intervals. Pools of liquid mud respond to the thermal pressure with a thick, rolling motion. Gas escapes through cracks that widen and close as temperatures fluctuate. Instruments placed by researchers record readings that often exceed 500 degrees Celsius at the source. The surrounding ice remains in place only because of constant replenishment from higher ridges. Mutnovsky volcano presents a clear view of two systems interacting in real time. Ice moves downward through channels carved by previous seasons, while thermal energy reshapes the ground directly under it. The meeting point creates a landscape marked by color variations, abrupt temperature shifts, and surfaces that change without warning. Snow can evaporate within seconds when it reaches the hotter zones. The terrain holds stable paths, but they require careful observation since new vents can open during active periods. Closer to the crater rim, steam forms thick columns that reduce visibility to only a short distance. The sound of gas release becomes sharper, accompanied by the low vibration of circulating water deep underground. The edge of the crater widens into a field of vents, each producing its own pattern of pressure and heat. Lingering traces of sulfur settle on nearby rocks in thin yellow layers. Gorli volcano. Just beyond the slopes of Mutnovsky, the terrain settles into a different state of activity. The steam thins, and the ground opens toward a broad volcanic structure known as Gorli volcano. Its summit holds a series of overlapping craters, formed through repeated cycles of collapse and eruption, each marking a separate phase in its long development. One of these craters contains a lake that immediately draws attention. The water fills the basin completely, resting far below the rim in a confined space surrounded by steep rock walls. Its surface carries a strong turquoise tone, produced by a high concentration of dissolved minerals and acidic compounds released through ongoing volcanic interaction below. Along the inner rim, narrow vents continue to release gas at irregular intervals. The movement is slow and measured, spreading thin layers of vapor across the surface before dispersing upward. Nothing around the crater suggests motion beyond these subtle changes. The lake holds its level. The walls remain fixed. The gases rise and clear. From the rim, the scene stays unchanged, allowing the eye to rest on the surface below and the processes continuing out of sight. Spokojny waterfall. A steady rush of falling water breaks the silence that often settles around the volcanic slopes. The stream gathers strength from meltwater channels before dropping in a straight descent, roughly 16 meters over a basalt ledge. The curtain of white contrasts with the surrounding terrain, which still holds traces of older eruptions in the form of dark rock and loose ash. Close to the base, moisture spreads across a patch of bright grass shaped by continuous spray. Spokojny waterfall takes its name from the Russian word for calm, a description that fits the consistent flow of the cascade rather than the setting that surrounds it. The water originates in higher catchments carved by seasonal runoff, where the ground shifts between hardened lava and soft sediment carried from the upper ridges. These variations guide the stream into a narrow path before directing it over the cliff. The area around the plunge pool remains cooler than the exposed slopes, creating small pockets of vegetation that form a sharp transition from the drier volcanic ground nearby. The sound of water against the rock keeps a stable rhythm, marking a brief change in pace before the route continues toward the wider wilderness to the south. The Kuril Islands. A steady ripple on the waterline marks the moment when the first bear enters the shallows. More shapes follow, gathering along the same stretch of shoreline with a rhythm that repeats each summer. Kuril Lake, the second largest freshwater lake in Kamchatka, draws these movements into a single basin supported by a concentrated salmon migration that builds through the warmer months. As the numbers rise, bears take positions across the inlet, and it becomes possible to see well over 20 individuals within a short field of view. Their activity begins when salmon push through the narrow channels. Adults hold their stance and track the current for short bursts of movement. Cubs stay close, watching each adjustment in weight as adults make quick, efficient strikes. Most bears arrive when the first strong pulse of fish enters the lake in early summer. Routes leading from surrounding valleys guide individuals toward the shoreline, and the gathering grows as new arrivals take up positions. Daily movement follows a clear sequence. Bears wade, shift toward deeper pockets, rest on gravel bars, and return to the same locations as the current changes. Cubs repeat the paths of the adults, learning where the fish gather and how to approach them without disrupting the group. They hunt for fish and eat continuously until they are fat enough to accumulate fat reserves before overwintering. The salmon provide a dense source of energy, and the bears make full use of the window while the migration remains strong. As the feeding cycle continues, trails of disturbed sediment settle after each pass through the shallows. Water levels shift with the returning current, and the bears redistribute themselves around new pockets of activity formed by changes in the migration pulse. Salmon runs, a wide expanse of moving water marks the beginning of the migration. The Sea of Okhotsk supports dense concentrations of plankton and small fish, creating feeding grounds for orcas and grey whales that follow predictable routes along the coast. These nutrient-rich currents also sustain the early life stages of the salmon that will later travel inland. When water temperatures stabilize in early summer, the first groups begin to move toward fresh water. The first sign of the salmon run often appears as a sudden flash of red just beneath the surface. Individual fish arrive in early summer when water temperatures begin to stabilize and their numbers build steadily as the season advances. Each salmon follows the same biological drive: return to the freshwater system where it originated, release eggs, and complete its life cycle. The upstream movement is essential because the gravel beds in these rivers provide the precise flow, oxygen levels, and substrate needed for successful spawning. As the run strengthens, the river fills with continuous motion. Fish push against the current in short bursts, regroup in slower sections, and advance again. Their bodies change color as they shift fully into spawning condition. Once the females reach suitable gravel beds, they clear shallow depressions and deposit eggs. Males hold position beside them for a brief window before both weaken. The final stage of the cycle ends shortly after spawning, and the bodies settle along the margins of the river. The remains become an important nutrient source for the surrounding system. Bears moving between Kuril Lake and the connected channels feed on the carcasses that accumulate in clusters. Birds and smaller predators use exposed sections where the current slows. Decomposition releases material that settles in the sediment and enters the roots of nearby vegetation. The river adjusts throughout the season as new waves arrive, shifting gravel and reshaping the channel in response to the continuous flow toward the lake and coastal outlets. Geysers Valley. Steam rises through small breaks in the surface, giving an early indication of how much heat is stored below. Melted rock near the upper crust warms the groundwater and drives the activity that shapes the Valley of Geysers. The area includes 25 major geysers and about 175 smaller vents, each releasing water and steam in regular cycles. Moist ground around the vents supports narrow bands of microbial mats and mosses that form recognizable color zones along the runoff paths. The valley still carries visible records of a major event in 2007. A powerful landslide moved downslope at roughly 22 to 25 miles per hour, removing vegetation and carrying mud, snow, and rock toward the river corridor. The debris created a temporary dam that flooded several well-known features, including thermal terraces, waterfalls, and multiple geysers such as pervinets. Thick layers of sediment redistributed the flow of hot water and changed the pattern of steam emerging across the lower terraces. Recovery unfolded in separate stages. 6 years later, the water level of Lake Geysenoye dropped and revealed vents long buried under the flood deposits. In 2014, another slide sent material through the Geysenoye River channel. The surge damaged the natural dam, drained the lake, and exposed additional features. Mali Geyser resumed activity, and a new geyser, later named Veer, developed as pressure reorganized beneath the surface. As steam moves across the basin and the light shifts, recently uncovered channels and fresh deposits become easier to distinguish, guiding the route toward the broader geothermal formations ahead. Uzon caldera. A wide depression bordered by fractured ridgelines marks the entrance into a collapsed structure formed by older volcanic activity. The basin spans roughly 6 miles across and is known as Uzon caldera. Its interior contains a mix of thermal pools, sections of forest, mineral flats, and active vents releasing columns of steam that shift in height with changes in underground pressure. Each feature occupies ground shaped by the earlier collapse that emptied the chamber beneath and lowered the surface. The geothermal fields show the most visible motion. Boiling mud rises in controlled pulses, forming patterns that change as gas channels reorganize below. Narrow streams carry mineral deposits towards shallow pools, creating raised edges where layers settle over time. Vegetation develops in concentrated clusters where cooler groundwater reaches the surface, adding pockets of green among the exposed thermal zones. The arrangement of these elements shows a landscape still adjusting, with new deposits forming alongside older remnants of the collapse. Several areas highlight clear stages of natural renewal. Ash-covered ground has shifted into small grasslands, and shrubs have begun to take hold along the inner slopes. Lakes formed after the collapse maintain stable levels through feeder channels that cross the basin floor. The overlapping layers of water, heat, sediment, and fresh vegetation create a record of gradual reorganization within the caldera. Avacha Pass and Camel Mountain. Between the towering giants of the Central Range lies a high-altitude corridor known as the Avacha Pass. This area serves as a base camp for travelers and offers a landscape that feels more approachable than the remote calderas. The centerpiece of this pass is an unusual rock formation called Camel Mountain. From a distance, its jagged, double-humped silhouette clearly resembles a camel resting in the snow. It is actually a volcanic extrusion, a plug of magma that hardened and was later exposed by wind and erosion. Unlike the dead zones of the north, the pass is full of small, frantic life. It is the territory of the Arctic ground squirrels, locally known as Ivrashka. These small, golden-furred creatures are famously bold, often standing upright on rocks to watch intruders. While we struggle to keep our footing on the loose scree and cold slopes, these creatures move with absolute ease. They are the true locals here, perfectly engineered for a landscape that humans can only endure for a few hours at a time. Tolbachik Volcano. A stretch of fractured lava fields extends across the lower flank, shaped by a series of fissure eruptions that redirected molten rock in long, uneven flows. The terrain leads toward Tolbachik Volcano, where the surface breaks into ridges of solidified basalt, ash plains, and isolated vents that still emit faint traces of heat. The ground carries a sharp texture, with stones fractured into angular pieces and coated in fine deposits from past activity. The visual character of the area shifts quickly. Older lava cooled into smooth, dark surfaces, while newer flows formed rough structures with deep cavities and sharp edges. Ash layers create muted color bands across the open field, and sections of scorched soil mark the path of more recent thermal movement. Tolbachik became a testing site for Lunokhod rover prototypes due to the uneven ground and low-contrast lighting conditions. The varied slopes and fragmented lava made it possible to evaluate traction, sensor accuracy, and equipment durability under demanding terrain. These tests left faint traces still visible along certain routes, where the surface shows compressed tracks and disturbed ash. As light moves across the lava plain, the outlines of newer fissures become distinct, guiding the path toward the high cones and the volcanic corridor that continues deeper into the range. The dead forest tall. Dark silhouettes stand across an open field of ash and compacted sand, marking the remnants of a forest buried during the 1975 eruption of Tolbachik. The trunks rise without branches, their surfaces hardened by heat and stripped of color. They form a fixed pattern on the landscape, each one positioned exactly where the living tree once anchored itself before the flow of hot material moved through the valley. The ground carries a muted mix of gray and red tones left by layers of volcanic deposits. Wind shifts the loose ash into shallow ripples that collect around the bases of the trunks. The stillness of the area gives a clear view of the scale of the event. An entire stretch of forest, preserved in its final position, altered in form, but still aligned with the slope that shaped its growth. The visual weight comes from the contrast between the intact vertical lines of the trees and the blank space around them, creating a scene that conveys both loss and endurance through its physical structure. The arrangement of the trunks creates clear lines across the ash plain, showing how the forest once stood before the eruption reshaped the slope. Subtle rises and depressions in the ground follow the direction of the old flow, and the spacing between the trunks highlights the scale of the buried woodland. The open field extends toward the higher volcanic formations, linking this preserved fragment of destruction to the larger landscape shaped by the same event. Kluchevskaya Sopka volcano. The landscape rises in a steady incline until the ground forms a broad pedestal of dark volcanic material. Above this foundation stands Kluchevskaya Sopka, the highest active volcano in Eurasia and one of the most prominent cones in the entire volcanic belt. Its slopes angle upward in a near-perfect symmetry, coated in snow that remains through much of the year. The height and shape allow the summit to dominate every surrounding valley, becoming a fixed reference point for anyone traveling across this region. The surface near the lower flanks consists of older lava flows, compacted ash, and long channels carved by meltwater. These features lead the eye upward toward the central cone, where the gradient increases sharply. Occasional activity releases narrow plumes that rise through the cold air before dispersing, drawing a visible line between the snowfield and the open sky. The scale of the cone becomes clearer when small ridges and secondary vents appear as faint markings on its lower slopes, emphasizing how large the structure is relative to the terrain below. Communities that have lived in the surrounding valleys for generations regard Kluchevskaya Sopka as a defining presence within the landscape. The mountain influences travel routes, seasonal decisions, and the orientation of settlements. Its continuous activity has shaped the distribution of rivers, vegetation, and natural corridors used by wildlife. The combination of height, form, and geological influence has made the cone a central landmark in both cultural memory and physical geography. The cone stands in full view from the surrounding valleys, and its scale becomes clearer as the ridgelines around it settle into the background. Subtle movements of vapor near the summit mark areas of ongoing activity, tracing narrow paths across the upper slope. The Pacific coastline. Long stretches of basalt cliffs form the last boundary of Kamchatka before the landscape meets the open Pacific. The rock has been shaped by repeated volcanic events, leaving sharp ridges, broken shelves, and vertical faces that extend for miles along the waterline. Waves strike these formations in steady intervals, pushing white spray upward and carving new patterns into the darker surfaces. From above, the coastline shows a continuous sequence of inlets and narrow coves where the ocean concentrates its movement. Wind crossing the peninsula accelerates as it reaches the edge, carrying salt and cold air across the cliff tops. The patterns of the waves become clearer at elevation, revealing the force that moves through this section of coast throughout the year. Occasional swells rise high enough to cover entire ledges before retreating into deeper water, leaving thin trails of foam that trace the contours of the shore. The Steller's sea eagle appears intermittently along this route. Its flight path follows the updrafts created by the collision of wind and rock. Seen from a distance, the bird moves in a controlled arc above the cliffs, tracking fish drawn toward the shallows by shifting currents. The presence of the eagle adds a marked scale to the environment, showing how large the vertical drops are compared to the silhouette moving above them. The cliffs lower as the coastline bends toward a sheltered stretch of water. The sound of breaking waves fades, replaced by slower movement in a deep inlet ahead. The channel widens gradually, showing calmer surfaces shaped by protection from the open sea. This change in water behavior marks the approach to Ruskaya Bay, where larger marine animals often pass through the deeper routes carved into the fjord-like basin. Ruskaya Bay and the orcas. A smooth ripple, a brief distortion of the surface, and then a black fin rises with absolute control. The entrance to Ruskaya Bay is narrow, and the inlet stretches inward, like a protected corridor of calm water. Even without many wide views of the cliffs, the sense of enclosure remains clear through the stillness of the bay, and the muted echo of distant surf. Russkaya Bay concentrates life in a way the open coast cannot. Its deep, cold layers hold steady currents that attract the region's most efficient hunters. Groups of orcas work the channel with precision. Their movement is deliberate, almost measured, as they scan the water for salmon, returning from the Pacific, or for seals resting on isolated rocks. The social structure becomes easier to read when the water is quiet. A mature female often leads the group, setting the pace, while younger individuals adjust their spacing behind her. Each rise and fall of a dorsal fin marks a coordinated pattern, a family moving as one unit across a confined stretch of water. Vocalizations bounce through the bay and linger longer than in open ocean, creating a natural amphitheater for sound. The presence of orcas shifts the entire rhythm of the inlet. Seabirds lift off early, the waterline stays unsettled, and every shape at the surface carries weight. As the group travels deeper into the bay, the last fins sink beneath the surface, leaving only the faint ring of disturbed water to mark their passage. We began with a question about the places where humans no longer set the rules. After crossing rivers, valleys, volcanoes, and the open sea, the answer has shown itself in the most direct way possible. Kamchatka continues on its own, shaped by ice, heat, and the animals that depend on these cycles. Nothing here adjusts for us. Nothing pauses to make room. The landscape moves at a scale far larger than any plan we could impose. As the last view of the coast settles into the distance, the peninsula leaves a clear impression. There are still parts of the world that operate without our guidance, and Kamchatka remains one of them, steady, remote, and complete in its own rhythm.